유럽의 자연, 그 푸르름에 물들다. 유로피안 내추럴리스트.
신도 브레이뉴.
72시간의 기다림. 마침내 나를 의식하지 않게 되었다. 니콘 리얼리티. 역시 니콘.
The last book of the Bible describes a terrifying vision. The battle that marks the beginning of the end, of the world, of history, of time. The forces of good will meet the forces of evil, and the result will be destruction on a scale beyond human imagining. Armageddon. But while the story is the stuff of prophecy, of faith rather than fact, the place Armageddon does exist. It's called Megiddo, a place of violence, battered by armies and earthquakes, rebuilt by generations of Jewish kings who charged it with the protection of their holy places. Across 60 centuries, this hilltop has seen the rise and fall of 30 cities.
The walls are gorgeous, curved exactly the way that we would do it today.
Now, our investigators have come here to understand why, of all the cities in this blood-soaked land, the writer of the book of Revelation chose Megiddo.
What is it that inspired him to find this site, Megiddo, as the site of his vision of Armageddon?
This is the lost world of the city of Armageddon. This is Megiddo, an ancient settlement in northern Israel which takes in a large hill and the plains beneath. In ancient Hebrew, the word for hill is Har, and for 2,000 years, the Har at Megiddo has given its name to what Christian tradition says is the ultimate showdown between good and evil. Har Megiddo has become Armageddon. St. John the Apostle set out his vision of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation.
And the kings of the whole world would assemble for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. And they assembled them at a place which is called Armageddon.
He imagined these plains as the place where the final battle would be fought. Our investigators have come here to find out why. Mark Telesnik is a geotechnical engineer. By looking at Megiddo's fortifications, he can build a picture of how the city changed and grew through biblical history.
It's a huge project on our scale. If we think about a shopping center that we build today, they're a lot smaller than that. All floored and tiled and leveled with a fence around it. Huge project.
Ori Soltesz is an archaeologist with a special expertise in the Holy Land. He aims to piece together the clues and bridge the gap between scripture and history.
From Tutmosis to Solomon to Ahab to Josiah, and of course finally to John looking back at the whole thing and seeing in Har Megiddo Armageddon, the place where in the future good and evil will meet and reality as we know it will end.
1,500 years before the birth of Christ, Megiddo belonged to a people called the Canaanites. Back then, this place was marked by the meeting of two great roads. 35 centuries on, that has not changed.
Wow, this is Armageddon. It's a crossroads now, a massive crossroads. It's a mess of trucks and cars. You can see the road heading south by west towards the sea, and another one more by south by east. And, well, Megiddo, the mountain, is up that way, and all around us is chaos.
Ori drives the road to Megiddo with archaeologist Yotam Tepper.
Why is Megiddo so important? Why is this pass important?
The pass is important because this is the most easy way to came between Egypt and Mesopotamia.
So then Megiddo itself, because it commands the pass, becomes important.
Like this is a very good place to control.
3,500 years ago, Megiddo stood at a pass between the lands of three great powers. To the east lay the wealthy lands of Mesopotamia. To the north, the land of the Hittites. The south belonged to the mighty Egyptian Empire. The Egyptian pharaoh Tutmosis was the first of many to identify Megiddo as a place of great strategic value. He is said to have declared, to capture Megiddo is to capture 1,000 towns. Tutmosis realized that Megiddo was vital to his nation's trading interest and decided to make it his own. What followed was the first battle in recorded history. And though it was fought 35 centuries ago, we know exactly how it unfolded. The record is carved into the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, Egypt. Tutmosis was proud of his victory and the way he won it. He wanted it remembered. As a result, what we have is a blow-by-blow account of the battle. Its key moment is a tactical maneuver so cunning and so daring that it's still taught in military colleges today. The hieroglyphs tell us that the pharaoh assembled his army south of the mountains that surround Megiddo. The Canaanites were waiting for him. They guarded both the southern and northern approaches to the city in case of attack. So Tutmosis took a third, far riskier route. He led his army down a narrow pass through the mountains. If they were spotted, the Egyptian army would have had no escape route. They would have been slaughtered.
So the troops are displayed out there on the plain. They realize that Tutmosis' troops are coming right through the pass and not from the south further, not from the north.
But the gamble paid off. When Tutmosis attacked, he did so with the advantage of complete surprise.
Tutmosis defeats them quite handily, as it turns out, in spite of their defensible position up the hill. But then, as his troops are busy plundering, the survivors take refuge in this citadel, which is here.
Even in the face of the pharaoh's decisive victory on the battlefield, the city was still a powerful stronghold. It held out.
They managed to sustain a siege for several months until Tutmosis is finally able to take Megiddo completely and make it an outpost for Egypt.
There were fortifications on this hilltop even before the coming of the Egyptians. Archaeological finds at Megiddo hold the key to a history that predates even the first recorded battle in the world. Our investigators want to decode these clues to find out just how far back Megiddo's history stretches. Ori Soltesz meets archaeologist Israel Finkelstein.
This is a window into the history of Megiddo, and this is also a window into the history of this land, and it takes you through some of the big names like Thutmose III. You can see the stratification, the accumulation of many cities one on top of the other.
So how many strata are there?
30 cities, one on top of the other, covering a span of time starting in late Neolithic times, let's say around 6000 BC, something like that.
So this time slice takes us from way before we get to Tutmosis.
Through the evidence found on the ground here, we now know that there's been a settlement at Megiddo for over 6,000 years, making it one of the most ancient in the world.
It has various names like Telalio.
Our engineer Mark Telesnik meets Norma Franklin. She's agreed to show him some of the oldest parts of Megiddo. The hill appears to have first been a site for ritual sacrifice.
Here we have a famous round altar at Megiddo. It's a flight of steps going up to the altar. They have cut marks in them, that is the depressions, whether they were used for putting water libation in there or oil. There's one there. But whether these steps were used by a priest or a number of priests, or whether they took animals up here for sacrifice, we don't know. But what we do know, here we have pure unadulterated cult, sacrifice, temples, everything that goes with it.
4,000 years before St. John made Megiddo a site of importance to the Christian faith, this was a place where far older religions were practiced. Ori Soltesz sees the foundations of what may have been one of the world's oldest places of worship.
This is really a fantastic monument because it's extremely well built, extremely monumental. You can see the northern wall over there, the big one, about 4 meters thick. And then in between you have
13 feet thick.
Right,
Wow.
and in between you have the hall, the temple hall, because it's a temple, and 6 big basalt pillar bases.
So this is what the round object there is.
The pillar bases supporting wooden pillars, which in turn supporting the beams of the roof.
Interpreting what archaeologists have found, it's possible to get an idea of what this very early temple may have looked like. Stone walls 13 feet thick, a roof supported by pillars built on stone foundations, immense and solid, and yet it still fell.
When you look at the wall here, there are cracks.
Right. You mean
on
you're
the-
talking about this crack
right,
here
the
that runs
face of
through the
wall.
rock?
Exactly. This and other cracks, similar cracks, and this is evidence for a major earthquake that wrecked Megiddo and destroyed the temple and made the people leave and abandon the site for about 2 centuries. And this is not surprising because Megiddo is sitting on a major fault, the Carmel Fault, so it is sensitive to seismic activity.
The first time Megiddo was destroyed, it fell not to an army, but to an unstoppable force of nature. A mighty earthquake destroyed not only the temple, but the entire settlement. It tore through the city's foundations. Could it be that the natural disasters that took place here were part of what led John to name Megiddo as the site of the ultimate catastrophe? A place where even the land itself carried the threat of annihilation. Our investigators have discovered that 6,000 years ago, Megiddo was an important place of worship, a place of temples and sacrificial altars. That it was first destroyed not by war, but by earthquake. And yet it became the site of the first recorded battle on Earth. At the crossroads of empires, Megiddo commanded a strategic military position and would be fought over for centuries to come. It would become one of the most highly defended cities in the ancient world, protecting one of the greatest temples in history. Our investigators are in northern Israel on the road to Armageddon.
Doesn't look very fierce where we are now. There doesn't seem to be much of anything that would have to do with destruction.
They've discovered that Armageddon is a real place, Megiddo. That it was the site of the first battle in recorded history, but had existed thousands of years before even that as a sacred place used by pagans for worship. And that it was the site of a catastrophic earthquake. All these may have contributed to John, author of the book of Revelation, identifying Megiddo as the location of the battle at the end of the world. Now, our investigators want to find out more about Megiddo when it first entered Jewish history, an era John would have known about and which may have influenced his vision of its apocalyptic future. In the 12th century BC, Har Megiddo had already had several incarnations as a city. Defenses were in place. It had been constructed with precision.
This gateway, which we used to call the city gate, we now know it was a gate to the Acropolis, a gate to the upper city, was built during the time of Thutmose III or immediately afterwards under the patronage of the Egyptian. And we would have had a huge mud brick arch here. In fact, we would have had a construction of sort of a vaulting of 3 arches going across, and then they would be interconnected. So this whole gateway would be roofed over. This is limestone, and at the bottom, where you needed protection from the rainwater that we can presume was perhaps coming out of the city, or the passage of the wheeled vehicles, they put basalt. So this was extra strength. Basalt is exceedingly strong.
And Israel Finkelstein shows Ori Soltesz evidence of further fortification here.
This is one of the chambers of the gate. We are in the gatehouse, exactly.
So the conqueror has to come through here,
Right.
and what's left and right.
And this is the most sensitive part of the fortification of the city.
Using the information our investigators have gathered, we can now rebuild Megiddo as it may have appeared in the 12th century before Christ, when, according to the Bible, God's chosen people, the Israelites, captured it. Megiddo had an impressive wall and tower. Earth was banked up around these walls to create steep ramparts. The city had a formidable gate, and yet it still fell. We know this because Scripture records the event. For although John was the last person to mention Megiddo in the Bible, he wasn't the first. The Old Testament tells us that after Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, he passed the leadership of his people onto Joshua. Joshua took them on a war of conquest. Tradition says that as they marched with the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest icon in the Jewish religion, they were unstoppable. And John, a scholar with Jewish ancestry, would have been familiar with this account.
John would have had a great knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, he grew up, we can only presume, as a Jew, and he was a learned man. He would have known about the great battles that always took place at Megiddo. And this had a profound effect on the thinking at the time, and it would have carried on down to the time of John.
So Joshua tore down the walls of Jericho. Did he also take Megiddo? Ori Soltesz wants to know what evidence there is for Joshua conquering the city.
There's a reference to Megiddo, and in Joshua 12, it lists Megiddo, the king of Megiddo, among the cities that he took. So, do we have any evidence of that kind of activity for Megiddo? I mean, it has Joshua right here.
Yes, there's no evidence for Joshua at Megiddo, but there's evidence for the destruction of the Canaanite city, and the question is whether we can connect it to the biblical description to Joshua.
Right.
The destruction of Canaanite Megiddo can be dated around the 12th century BC. So if you wish, this is supposedly the time which fits the inner biblical logic of the conquest of Joshua.
Having taken the city, the Israelites held it for centuries and would continue to strengthen and fortify Megiddo. Under their ownership, it took on a new, more vital strategic importance. In the 10th century BC, the city of Armageddon was rebuilt by King Solomon. According to the Bible, Solomon built a spectacular gateway. He did so because he knew that if Megiddo were to be captured, the nation and its capital Jerusalem would be vulnerable. Ori Soltesz wants to learn the gateway's practical purpose.
This is the famous Solomonic gate.
So we're walking through the gate.
Yes, inside we have a tower, and then one chamber over here,
right,
and then a pier, and then another chamber, and then a third chamber, and we are still in the gatehouse here.
Right.
The gateway was essentially a tunnel, channeling traffic into the city through a narrow space. The recesses in its walls were each wide enough to hold a chariot with 2 horses.
The gate was connected to a system of fortifications. There was a big wall, a solid wall, 3.5 meters, which would make, 11 feet.
Yeah.
It's a long passageway.
In addition to the gateway, there were towers set into the walls that encircled the city. Massive resources were plowed into the construction of these defenses because they were intended to guard not only the people inside, but the entire nation of Israel. Next, our investigators search for the reason Solomon was so desperate to protect Jerusalem, home to the sacred heart of Judaism, the Holy Temple. Because defeat at Megiddo led ultimately to the temple's destruction. One of the greatest disasters ever encountered by the Israelites. Their original Armageddon.
내 차가 더러워질까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 집에 냄새가 날까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 배낭이 무거워질까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 돈 드는 게 아까워 우리나라에 버렸습니다.
당신은 부끄럽지 않게 대한민국을 외칠 수 있습니까? 공익광고협의회
제2차 세계대전, 그 누구도 보지 못했던 2차 세계대전의 이공계 컬러 영상.
investigators are in Israel exploring Armageddon, the ancient city at Har Megiddo. They've discovered that 3,000 years ago, King Solomon went to great lengths to fortify the citadel. And now they've come 60 miles south to Jerusalem, the ancient capital of the Jewish nation, to find out why. They're looking for traces of the structure that Megiddo was intended to protect. The apocalyptic vision of St. John, a follower of Christ, may have its roots in what Solomon built here, the first temple. For the Judean people, it would become the focus of their worship, the core of their identity. Ultimately, it would be destroyed. For centuries, people schooled in the Jewish tradition, John among them, would look back on its loss as the greatest catastrophe in their history, a kind of first Armageddon.
The temple in Jerusalem was absolutely everything. Nothing could go on without the temple. It governed every aspect of people's lives. If you were a farmer, you couldn't eat of your own produce until you had taken an offering to God, because God lived in the temple. His spirit was in the temple. Trying to reconstruct the temple and understand what sort of building it was is very, very problematic. It's near impossible for us as archaeologists to fully understand what was there, because we can't excavate on the Temple Mount today. So it's a piece of detective work to try and reconstruct it.
Nothing remains of Solomon's temple, but our investigators have set themselves the task of discovering what this most sacred building looked like.
Today, the Jerusalem skyline is dominated by the Dome of the Rock, built in the 7th century. But before that, there was a Roman temple. Before that, Herod's expansion of the Second Temple. We're looking further and further back to Solomon's temple, under thousands of years, under myriad layers of material, to ask what that temple might have looked like.
The Book of Kings says that the walls of the temple were made of stone blocks, ashlars, cut and finished before they were brought to the construction site. Mark Telesnik goes to see what the building blocks of the temple would have looked like.
We know that Solomon's temple was built from ashlar blocks similar to this in size. And Solomon's guys had the ability to make holes like this. They would then put wooden blocks up on top and wet them. When the blocks wet, they expand and cause the rock to break below.
Stonemasons today use heavy machinery to work this hard stone. When the temple was built, every block would have been cut by hand.
I can't imagine how much time and how much work and effort must have gone into taking one of these things, trimming them, all sides, in all directions, and we're just talking about one block. They had to make hundreds and thousands of these blocks in order to get everything ready for the temple.
Ori Soltesz wants to find out what the temple looked like as a whole. We know its dimensions. As scripture says, its length was 60 cubits, and its breadth 20 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. But in order to put that into perspective, we need to know how big a cubit is. Dr. Gabby Barkai has made a discovery that could hold the answer. It lies hidden beneath the Church of the Dominican Fathers in Jerusalem. This is a rock-carved tomb which preserves the style of architecture used in the time of Solomon. Most intriguingly, the dimensions and proportions of the tomb suggest that it was built using a particular unit of measurement, equivalent to approximately 21 inches. It's led Dr. Barkai to believe that they mark an Egyptian cubit, said to represent the length of a pharaoh's arm.
The measurements are exactly 10 by 8 by 7 cubits. The height is 7 cubits and the length is 10 cubits. The proportions are very pleasant to the human eye. These are done exactly in the long Egyptian cubit, which probably was the standard measurement used in Solomon's temple.
So what aspects of the decor here would connect us to Solomon's architectural style?
Now, the meeting point of the ceiling with the walls has those double cornices, which is a very interesting feature.
In Solomon's time, we know architects used wood to panel the walls and wooden cornicing to support the ceiling. It's a style that's mimicked here in stone.
So they've cut cornices out of stone as if they were
wooden beams. Yes. It is written about Solomon that he coated the temple of Jerusalem with cedar beams, and in the walls there are sunken panels, imitations of wooden paneling. So you have one sunken panel here underneath, you have another sunken panel, and a beam in between.
The Bible states that King Hiram of Tyre gave cedar trees to Solomon, and these were used to span the ceiling.
Cedar is the most prestigious, most expensive, and most suitable type of wood.
Suitable for
construction. It is very hard and strong.
Cedar beams could easily span a room of 65 feet or more, and this, combined with their strength, made them the ideal building material. Given that this tomb dates from the time of Solomon and echoes its style, it may complete the puzzle. It is effectively a record of the style used when the temple was built and the proportions used to construct it. It's now possible for our investigators to build a picture of what Solomon's temple might have looked like. Using the Egyptian cubit as a base, we can calculate it was around 100 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 80 feet tall. The walls were built with ashlar stone blocks. The roof was spanned by crossbeams of Lebanese cedar. A porch led to the largest room, its walls lined with cedar wood panels. At the west end lay the Holy of Holies, the most sacred chamber where Solomon placed the Ark of the Covenant, the most revered icon of the Jewish faith. Scripture records that he created an awe-inspiring building, but in doing so, he made his nation vulnerable. The temple was the nation's heart, and for it to be taken or destroyed by an enemy power would be the ultimate disaster. Solomon knew this, and he readied his kingdom for attack. Solomon had begun by fortifying Megiddo with a mighty gate. His successors would continue his work and transform this fortress into one of the most advanced military strongholds of the ancient world. The book of Revelation describes the battle which will bring about the end of the world. The tradition that it will take place at the city of Megiddo, Armageddon, has its roots in ancient Jewish history. Our investigators have discovered how, when he came to power in the 11th century BC, the great King Solomon envisaged Megiddo as his country's first line of defense. It was tasked with guarding the road to Jerusalem and the very foundations of the Jewish faith. Solomon had built Jerusalem's holy temple, and by doing so, he had created a place so vital and sacred to the Israelites that its loss or desecration would represent the ultimate catastrophe. Accordingly, over the course of 4 centuries, the golden age of the kings of Israel, Solomon's descendants rebuilt and reinforced Megiddo. Ori Soltesz and Mark Telesnik have returned here to build a picture of how the city was transformed. What had been a hilltop settlement became a mighty fortress. Its high walls could stand a determined assault, but the city's builders also planned for a time when their enemies would try to surround them, to cut off their supplies and force them to surrender. Situated on top of a hill, Megiddo may have appeared particularly vulnerable, but its engineers came up with an ingenious solution. Mark Telesnik and archaeologist Norma Franklin explore Megiddo's hidden lifeline.
This tunnel is amazing. We got a tunnel that's about 150 meters long.
Yes, or at least, yes.
And it's completely straight. The walls are gorgeous, curved exactly the way that we would do it today. You can see these chert layers, which sometimes are called flint as well. That's a very, very hard mineral. And it was probably a lot more work to run through this stuff compared to the limestone. But tell me something about the tunnel.
Well, the tunnel is actually an extension of a huge vertical shaft that led down from the near center of the tell. They had a water wheel.
The wheel drew water from a vertical shaft, which dates from the 9th century BC. Square in shape and descending 80 feet, it connected with a tunnel which ran another 260 feet. It led to a water source outside Megiddo's walls.
Okay, so this is the tunnel, and this is where the source of water would have come from?
This is actually, yes, the source is, we can still see it.
Let's just, how if I just drop a pebble in here?
But you can definitely hear it.
The covering on this water source is camouflaged with a layer of earth and invisible from the surface. No attacker would know of its existence, and Megiddo could survive an indefinite siege with its secret lifeline. This tunnel is a major feat of engineering, dug by hand with only primitive tools to work the hard stone. But the secret tunnel was just one of many preparations Megiddo's rulers made for attack. Among the ruins that litter the hilltop, archaeologist Israel Finkelstein sees evidence that these walls once housed a formidable fighting force.
So here we are in the Megiddo stable area. Is this just one large layer of stables? How many of them? How large?
Well, this is a system of stables. In fact, when you look at the results of past excavations and our own work here at Megiddo, it's quite amazing to see that there are 17 units like this one that we are in. And
so
they are
each
big,
unit is...
The archaeological evidence tells us that over 450 horses could be kept here. In a time of war, they would enable Megiddo's forces to go on the offensive. Pulling lightweight chariots, they would sweep out of the city gates, engage an enemy force on the plains below, and return quickly to the citadel.
Each unit of a stable like this is divided by 2 rows of pillars. Over here one row and over here another row, and between the pillars troughs. And that's why they are identified as stables.
In effect, the city has the equivalent of a battalion of mobile infantry. It had high walls to strengthen its hilltop position. It had a water supply that would last indefinitely. And yet, in spite of all these efforts to protect the city, Megiddo still fell 400 years after Solomon began the process of fortification. It was a simple tactical error. The decision by a Jewish king to abandon the safety of the city walls and instead engage the enemy in a pitched battle had catastrophic consequences. It happened in 609 BC when the powerful Egyptian empire mobilized a vast army. Under the command of Pharaoh Necho II, it set out to attack the rival state of Babylon. To get there, it had to cross the plains of Megiddo, and Necho sought permission from the Jewish king, Josiah. Josiah was said to be a great ruler, the equal of his ancestor, Solomon, and yet his actions all but caused the end of his bloodline. He refused to let the Egyptian army pass. Instead, he took his men down to the plain and confronted what must have been a far larger force. He paid for his stubbornness with his life.
He was executed here, and with the execution of Josiah at Megiddo, all the great hopes of the kingdom of Judah, everything collapsed.
The death of Josiah marked the coming of the darkest time in the story of the Israelites. Fatally weakened, the nation fell prey to its enemies. Within a few years, Jerusalem had fallen, the Holy Temple was torn down, and the people of Israel were exiled into slavery. A chain of events that began with the battle Josiah lost at Megiddo. The effects of the destruction of the temple would be felt down the centuries. It may be this event more than any other which led John to identify Har Megiddo as the site of the apocalypse, Armageddon.
Destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was an absolute catastrophic event. No temple, everything falls apart. Like a ship without a rudder. Where do we go? Everything is very different. It's the beginning of the end. For somebody like John, living in those terrible times, this event would have really foretold the end of the world, because it was for him the end of the known world.
If you're thinking back from 500 or 600 years later, death of Josiah, destruction of the temple, exile, the whole thing has a catastrophic atmosphere. The heir to all of that is John the Evangelist, and writing his book of Revelation, and he gets to the end point of time as we know it, the meeting of good and evil, and the place that he cites is Armageddon.
It shows that there was this memory that this was not only a terrible place where major battles were fought, battles that decided the fate of Western Asia, but also that this is the terrible place where the last righteous king of the lineage of David perished.
For centuries, greater and greater defenses had been plowed into the city. Megiddo was witness to some of the key events in the history of the Holy Land. The war that finally destroyed it was cataclysmic to the Jewish people. But it was the Roman superpower that finally secured Megiddo as the place of Armageddon. Our investigators are in Megiddo, northern Israel, the place which gave its name to Armageddon. St. John, in the book of Revelation, names this site as the location of the final battle between good and evil. And we've uncovered why John chose Megiddo. It was the site of the first recorded battle in history. Its strategic significance made it one of the most fought-over places on earth. And one of the key events in Jewish history happened here. The death of King Josiah on these plains began a chain of events which ended in the sacking of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Holy Temple, and the exile of the Israelites. 600 years later, as John set out his vision of the apocalypse, he looked back at these events. What place could be more fitting for the final battle?
So from up here, the whole plain looks like a vast kind of chessboard, and perhaps one can imagine the final battle between good and evil taking place in this kind of a setting, right at the edge of this hill, spread out across the valley.
John was clearly drawing on his nation's past, 1,000 years of Jewish history. But he must also have been influenced by the times in which he was living. It was an era of conflict and upheaval when his faith, the new religion of Christianity, was struggling to survive.
Early Christianity grew out of Judaism. At the time of John and early Christianity, there was very little difference between Christians and Jews. To be a Christian, you had to have come from the Jewish religion. So John was definitely a Jew. He would have been well versed in the Hebrew Bible. He would have understood exactly what was happening in his country.
So now, Ori Soltesz wants to know what role Megiddo played in the life of the early church, what it meant to John and the first Christians. Information is hard to come by because theirs was an underground religion. The majority were Jewish by birth, so were considered blasphemers. The Romans too were ferocious in their persecution of the followers of Christ. They couldn't build churches or even worship publicly, so left little physical trace.
I'm heading now towards, well, it was a Jewish village at one point, but now it's a prison. And there are some rather interesting things that have turned up here.
Hardly any archaeological evidence was found until 2005, when excavations from within the walls of this prison turned up an extraordinary find.
What are we looking at here? Let's see.
This is the mosaic we found inside the prison.
The jail is a maximum security facility. The site of the excavation has been covered over and remains inaccessible. Nonetheless, these images reveal a collection of mosaics adorned with startling inscriptions.
The mosaic. So first of all, this is the whole room. It's 10 by 5 meters, and the entrance is from the east.
And how do we know it's Christian?
Here, in this carpet, you can see also fish. This is an early Christian symbol.
Tuna and bass?
Tuna and bass, yeah. There is not typical local fish. They are from outside the country. So maybe the Roman army bring this symbol from outside.
But the real evidence that this was a Christian meeting place lies in the inscriptions, which refer to Jesus as God. This is the floor of a Christian meeting place, the earliest evidence of a Christian community ever to be found in the Holy Land.
This is what's so unique and so special. This is the earliest known of inscriptions.
So we may still be rewriting early Christian history based on this discovery.
Yeah, so
this is Roman period. This is 75, 100 years before Constantine makes religion legal. Christians had to be maximally secure about where and what they did.
The mosaics date to after the time of John, but were made long before Christianity was legalized. we know that it would one day grow to be a major world religion, but the first worshippers gathered in small, secret groups, taking great risks to spread their message. Clearly, one such group met at Megiddo, and evidence suggests that the forces of oppression were here too. Records tell us that this area held the largest concentration of Roman troops anywhere in Judea, outside of Jerusalem. It's a reminder that for 300 years, all the people of the Holy Land lived under Roman occupation. Their country was a Roman province. They were subject to a foreign power. Yotam Tepe shows Mark Telesnik the nearby remains of a Roman fort built to quell an uprising.
What we have here is a relatively large mound on a hill. Can you try to tell me why you think this was a Roman encampment?
Yeah. Have a look. A big handle of a jar. This is just one example of the pottery from the Roman period that we can find here in the field.
So we know for sure that the fields around us wouldn't have been part of the encampment?
No, because if you go there, we don't find any pottery there. So they are empty.
Okay.
It's clear from the scale of this site that a sizable army was stationed here.
The camp must have been huge because we're talking about from the corner here, 200 meters across here. That's 3 to 4 city blocks in New York City, by another 4 to 5 city blocks. So this is a huge encampment.
The fort has never been excavated and still lies beneath these crops, but the information we do have makes it possible to picture how this encampment would have looked.
Would they have built walls all the way around the encampment?
Yes, walls and ramp and everything.
Can you just give me a little bit of numbers that could help us try to figure out what it might have looked like?
Okay, we can say maybe 2 meters, maybe
wide,
more.
thick.
Wide, of course. And the height, maybe it's 5 or 10 meters. The tower maybe more.
5 meters is 2.5 stories. That's a little bit more than 15 feet, 2 meters wide. Who would have done the building?
The Legion have special units that done this job.
A rectangle 650 feet by 800 feet was marked out, leveled, and paved. This was surrounded by a wall 16 feet high and 6 feet wide, with a moat around the outside.
Do you have any idea what the camp might have looked like on the inside? What type of structures they would have built? And the soldiers would have been sleeping in tents, or they would have been wall structures?
No. There was a huge building for the barracks for the soldiers.
Within the walls was an extensive complex of barracks. It was safeguarded from attacks by an enormous gate and a watchtower. The fort once housed the 6th Legion, a force of 3,000 men. What happened here at Megiddo was typical of what was happening throughout the world of the first Christians. The armies of their enemies ranged all around, ready to kill and destroy. It's easy to imagine that as John wrote his vision, he might have believed that the ultimate conflict between good and evil was already underway. In 67 AD, facing a rebellious population, the Romans massed on the plains of Megiddo before marching on Jerusalem. In an echo of earlier history, when Josiah's death at Megiddo preceded the fall of the Temple of Solomon, the combined forces of 3 Roman legions tore down its replacement, the Second Temple.
Where so many battles were fought and so much blood was spilt, we can imagine why John would set his vision of the horrific end of time as we know it, the confrontation of good and evil, on the plains of Megiddo.
Megiddo played a pivotal role in the history of this country.
This is a window into the history of this land, and it takes you through some of the big names like Thutmose III, Joshua, of course, the great kings from Solomon to Josiah, King Necho of Egypt. All these big figures are associated with Megiddo.
They all left their mark here.
Megiddo's situation on the great crossroads of the Via Maris and the main road coming in from the sea out towards the Galilee and towards the great civilizations in the north, it was always important. And that's why you have all these battles that took place there, from the very first battle that we know about, the first battle in recorded history, until the last battle.
Our investigators have learned that for thousands of years, capturing Megiddo was the key to controlling this great land. Witness to countless battles since the beginning of history, molded by continuous conflict to become a mighty stronghold and a shield for the Holy Temple. The obliteration of this temple and the death of its king heralded the fall of a nation. The shockwaves of this disaster would reach across the centuries and would lead John to preserve Har Megiddo in our memories as the most feared place on earth. Armageddon.
History Channel.